Picture a teenage heiress, already living in a swirl of upper crust comfort, reared in California's most prestigious schools. Imagine that in one normal moment, quiet and unassuming, her entire existence flips upside down. She's dragged into a van, thrown into a dark closet, and systematically indoctrinated by a group of anti-government radicals wielding guns and preaching revolution. Sound outlandish? Absolutely. But for Patricia Hearst, this was the stark reality that transformed her from a college student into a fugitive, from a victim into a polarizing icon. As we journey through this narrative, we'll peel back the layers, exploring Patricia's background, the immeasurable power of her family, the inner workings of the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, and her controversial shift from captive to ardent guerrilla fighter, or so it seemed to many on the outside. Even decades later, the details remain disorienting, forcing us to wrestle with a question that still resounds. Was Patty Hearst a coerced pawn, a brainwashed victim, or a rebellious collaborator looking for a cause? To begin, let's zoom out and understand the magnitude of the Hearst family name. If you ever picked up a newspaper in the 20th century, especially the first half, you might have stumbled upon publications owned by the Hearst. William Randolph Hearst, Patty's grandfather, was a larger-than-life figure who transformed the news business into a high-powered empire. Go back as far as the mid-1800s, and you'll find the Hearst fortune expanding its roots, eventually amassing influence through newspapers that thrived on sensational headlines. Think of those early tabloids crying out from street corners. Giant blocky letters, lurid pictures, scandalous stories. That was William Randolph Hearst's domain, a territory he cultivated into one of the most powerful media conglomerates of his era. He didn't stop at newspapers either. His forays into politics, including a bid for the presidency in 1904, cemented the Hearst name in the collective American psyche. The family was synonymous with wealth, celebrity connections, and bold ambitions. Their political influence was feared, their social standing revered, and their publishing style thrived on shock value. Ironically, the very thing that would eventually shape Patty's own story in the public arena. Born on February 20th, 1954, Patricia Hearst was one of 5 sisters. Although all were heiresses in a sense, carrying that famous last name, Patricia would be the one whose life took on a cinematic quality. As a child, she attended private schools across California, enjoying resources and comforts that most of us can only dream of. And yet, by the time she turned 19, she was just another college student trying to find her place in the world. At Menlo College and later at the University of California, Berkeley, she was known to be engaged to Stephen Weed, an older man she had been dating since high school. From the outside, it looked like a conventional path for a young socialite. Good education, decent grades, and a stable relationship. But if you think her story ends there, you're in for a shock. Let's fast forward to February 4th, 1974, a chilly evening when Patricia and Stephen were in their apartment. No one was expecting any earth-shattering events that night. Then came a knock at the door. A young woman claimed she had crashed her car and needed to use the phone. The scenario seemed a little suspicious, but not overtly dangerous, until 2 men burst through the doorway. They tackled Stephen, beat him mercilessly, and subdued Patricia with swift brutality. She was blindfolded, her hands bound, her body tossed into a vehicle waiting outside. In a matter of minutes, Patricia Hearst had gone from living a quiet college life to becoming a kidnapped victim in one of the most notorious cases in American history. Her captors? A radical group calling themselves the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA. Think of this as an organization driven by fringe ideology, a blend of extreme leftist rhetoric, anti-capitalist sentiment, and revolutionary fervor. Led by Donald DeFreeze, a charismatic escaped convict, the SLA made no secret of its disdain for the U.S. government and corporate power. If you step back and consider the climate of the 1970s, it was a time rife with social upheaval. The Vietnam War had eroded trust in government. The civil rights movement had revealed deep structural inequities, and political assassinations had stained the national consciousness. Small extremist groups looking to save America from itself were not entirely uncommon, but the SLA stood out for its audacity and its readiness to use violence, including murder. Snatching a high-profile heiress like Patricia Hearst was part of that brazen methodology. She wasn't chosen randomly. She was a pawn in a grand scheme to extort power. The Hearst name carried massive influence, and the SLA wanted to leverage that name for publicity and leverage. At first, Patricia's parents, Randolph Apperson Hearst and Catherine Wood Campbell Hearst, scrambled to negotiate her release. They held press conferences outside their home, pleading publicly for the safe return of their daughter. The tension was palpable across the nation. Headlines blared with sensational updates, and every piece of new information was devoured by a population entranced by the drama. In the first 2 days, however, the kidnappers remained silent. As hours bled into days, hope wavered. Then the SLA contacted the Hearst family, demanding the release of 2 of their imprisoned members, Joe Ramiro and Russ Little. When that request fell flat, since even the Hearst's considerable clout couldn't force the state's hand, the SLA pivoted to a different tactic. They demanded that the Hearst family distribute $70 worth of food to every impoverished person in California. Dubbed the People in Need Project, this philanthropic gesture, albeit forced, seemed a potential path to Patricia's freedom. Randolph scrambled to secure funding, even though the family fortune was largely controlled by the aging patriarch, William Randolph Hearst. Randolph took out a loan, launched the massive effort, and tried to feed as many people as possible. But the project quickly descended into chaos, with logistical nightmares and riots overshadowing any goodwill. The SLA deemed the effort insufficient. Patricia stayed captive. It was at this point that Patricia's story began its descent into sheer unpredictability. According to her later accounts, she was held in a closet for weeks, blindfolded, threatened, psychologically manipulated, and repeatedly assaulted. She was forced to memorize radical screeds and lecture material, an indoctrination process carefully orchestrated to break her will and reshape her identity. The group showed her recordings of her parents' press conferences, telling her that her family never truly cared for her. She was told the world was a dark place where only the SLA was fighting for meaningful change. Over time, the chains that bound her were gradually loosened, but only so the group could further mold her into a tool for their cause. In April 1974, just 2 months after she was taken, the SLA released an audio recording to the media. The voice on the tape was Patricia's, but it no longer matched the frightened victim the nation had once imagined. She announced that she had taken the name Tanya, pledging allegiance to the SLA's mission. This bizarre twist rocked the country. Was she truly sympathizing with her captors, or was this a desperate survival strategy? Before long, security footage from a San Francisco bank robbery would become one of the most iconic images of the 1970s. There, brandishing an automatic rifle, was Patricia, now Tanya, demanding that the customers and staff lie on the floor while she and the SLA members emptied the vault. The Hibernia Bank heist instantly transformed her public image. Younger Americans from the counterculture movement, suspicious of the establishment, saw her as a modern Robin Hood, fighting alongside an anti-capitalist group. Older, more traditional Americans recoiled in horror, seeing a privileged heiress turned gun-toting villain. The black and white footage, replayed relentlessly, turned Patty Hearst into a symbol of radical transformation, whether coerced or voluntary. Yet the saga continued to escalate. Just 1 month later, in May 1974, Patricia was implicated in another violent episode. While waiting in a getaway van outside a store in Los Angeles, she fired shots at a store owner who chased out 2 SLA members for shoplifting. The store owner survived, but this was further confirmation. Patty Hearst was actively participating in criminal activities with her abductors. By this point, the FBI had zero doubts that she was a member of the SLA. She was no longer just a missing person. She was now on the FBI's most wanted list, making headlines from coast to coast. But the SLA's success was fleeting. The group took more hostages, hijacked vehicles, and planned further assaults. Finally, on May 17, 1974, the LAPD converged on the SLA's hideout in a Los Angeles neighborhood. What followed was a spectacle broadcast live on television, a barrage of gunfire that lasted for hours, culminating in a massive fire that killed several SLA members, including their leader, Donald DeFreeze. Patricia wasn't there. She and 2 other members, Bill and Emily Harris, had narrowly escaped that day. On the run, they stayed several steps ahead of law enforcement for over a year, rumored to be moving between safe houses, forging alliances with fringe radicals, and planning more acts of revolutionary violence. During this period, the SLA released another recorded message. Patricia took center stage once again, expressing sorrow for the death of William Wolfe, an SLA comrade rumored to be her lover. The sincerity of her anguish became a central point in the subsequent legal storm that awaited her. For the time being, though, Patty Hearst managed to evade capture, living a clandestine life in the SLA's diminishing circle. As the FBI closed in, the group's composition kept changing, with new loyalists joining and older members perishing or scattering. To finance their continued flight, they orchestrated more robberies, and Patricia served various roles, sometimes as a driver, sometimes as a lookout, and, according to prosecutors later, sometimes as a willing participant in planning sessions. Finally, on September 18, 1975, after more than 19 months, Patty Hearst's life as a fugitive came to an end. The FBI tracked her down in San Francisco, where she was staying with another SLA associate, Wendy Yoshimura. When federal agents burst in, Wendy surrendered immediately. Patricia, however, retreated briefly to another room, prompting a standoff that ended only when authorities threatened Wendy. Fearing for her friend's life, Patricia surrendered. Yet, in an astonishing twist, even as she was booked and questioned, her rhetoric remained as defiant as ever. She identified her occupation on intake documents as urban guerrilla and instructed her lawyer to relay a message of solidarity to her sisters and brothers in the SLA, emphasizing that she felt free and strong. However, captivity and fugitive life had taken a toll on her health. She weighed only 87 pounds, her IQ tests showed a dip from prior levels, and her memory was riddled with gaps. Medical professionals diagnosed her with various signs of physical and psychological trauma. Over the ensuing weeks, as she sat in jail speaking to doctors, lawyers, and FBI agents, something shifted. She distanced herself from the SLA's ideology, retracting her earlier statements and painting herself as a victim of relentless brainwashing, sexual assault, and threats. Now came one of the most divisive trials of the decade. Originally, her first lawyer, Terrence Hallinan, suggested she say little. Hallinan planned a defense that Patricia was involuntarily drugged during her captivity, which explained her compliance and perplexing behavior. But disagreements with co-counsel led to Hallinan's exit from the case, and famed attorney F. Lee Bailey stepped in. Bailey advanced a somewhat more conventional argument of brainwashing. Patricia had joined the SLA under the threat of death, battered by intimidation and traumatized by sexual violence at the hands of Donald DeFreeze and William Wolfe. The prosecution, however, led by James L. Browning Jr., argued she had acted of her own accord, citing instances where she allegedly had opportunities to flee but chose not to, or times she appeared to relish her role in the group's activities. At the trial, psychiatrists lined up on both sides. Dr. Harry Kozol for the prosecution depicted Patty as a thrill seeker, claiming that this was more a rebellious adventure than a coerced crisis. Another prosecution psychiatrist, Dr. Joel Fort, painted her as amoral, asserting that her claims of sexual assault were fabrications. The defense's doctors, however, testified that she was coerced, threatened, and psychologically broken, all culminating in behavior that resembled Stockholm Syndrome, where hostages bond with their captors out of terror and a desperate sense of self-preservation. The presiding judge, Oliver Jesse Carter, faced criticism for leaning toward the prosecution's narrative. He allowed the jury to hear a tape in which Patty, still in jail, passionately espoused radical beliefs to a friend who visited, but he disallowed tapes of her sessions with Dr. Louis Jolyon West, a psychiatrist who found evidence supporting brainwashing. The final act of the trial came in early 1976. Browning, in his closing, hammered home the idea that Patricia willingly participated while Bailey, reportedly appearing disorganized and possibly hungover, delivered a lackluster defense. The outcome: Patricia Hearst was convicted of bank robbery and using a firearm during a felony. Judge Carter sentenced her to 35 years in prison, though it was widely understood that a later hearing might reduce that time. Then, unexpectedly, Judge Carter passed away. His successor, Judge William H. Orrick Jr., offered a more lenient sentence of 7 years. Still, in the interim, Patricia appealed, eventually securing bail for a short period with the help of her father and a phalanx of bodyguards. But when the Supreme Court refused to hear her case, the appeals crumbled and she was sent back to prison. Her fate seemed sealed until President Jimmy Carter stepped in. In 1979, he commuted her sentence to the 22 months she had already served under conditions of probation. Just like that, the imprisoned heiress-turned-felon was free. Her legal battles weren't entirely over, but she was no longer behind bars. Life after the SLA was, unsurprisingly, complicated. 2 months after her release in 1979, Patty Hearst married Bernard Lee Shaw, one of the policemen who had guarded her while she was out on bail. This marriage marked the beginning of a more stable chapter. Together, they had 2 children. She sought normalcy, but never entirely escaped the scrutiny that followed her. In 1981, she published a memoir, Every Secret Thing, co-authored by Alvin Moscow. The book revisited the harrowing events of her captivity, detailing everything from her initial kidnapping to the psychological war waged against her. Interestingly, the publication stirred renewed interest among authorities, but no further charges were brought. Over time, Patricia Hearst found an unlikely new path in entertainment. John Waters, the eccentric director known for campy and subversive films, cast her in Cry Baby, 1990, a teen musical satire featuring Johnny Depp. It was a bizarre career pivot, from kidnapped heiress to comedic actress, but it stuck. She went on to appear in several more John Waters productions, as well as various television shows. Still, her name inevitably evoked memories of the SLA standoff, the bank surveillance footage, and the endless debate about whether she was victim or villain. In 2001, yet another president intervened in her story. On his final day in office, President Bill Clinton granted Patty Hearst a full pardon for her crimes. The narrative arc thus came full circle. Once the target of national vilification, she was now legally absolved. Over the decades, she's occasionally stepped back into the public eye, sometimes to star in a film cameo, sometimes to speak about her experiences on talk shows. She never misses the chance to reiterate how insulting it was to have her sexual assault allegations brushed aside, especially by legal experts who painted her as a willing partner to her captors. At one point, she called the prosecutor's claim that any relationship between her and William Wolfe was consensual outrageous, underscoring how that line of thinking perpetuates a dangerous narrative about sexual violence. Patty Hearst's saga exposes a collision between old money clout and revolutionary fervor in the 1970s, a decade in which social norms were in flux and radical movements were sprouting in discontented corners of the nation. You can read it as a cautionary tale about how trauma can warp identity. Alternatively, you might see it as proof that even the scions of wealthy dynasties can be pulled into the orbit of extremist politics. For the general public, especially in that tumultuous era, it was an unsettling reminder that no amount of privilege could guarantee safety or moral clarity. Brainwashing, forced captivity, assault. These are experiences that can warp a person's identity beyond recognition. Add to that the cult-like environment of the SLA, and you begin to see how easily a victim can be made to parrot radical doctrines, even to commit violent acts. Yet the judicial system largely showed little sympathy, and the public remained torn. If a person is threatened with death or systematically terrorized, should we hold them fully responsible for actions that might have been shaped by unthinkable fear? And if someone does begin to exhibit signs of genuine ideological transformation, at what point does captivity become collaboration? The Patty Hearst case never offered an easy resolution to these questions. It merely laid them bare, forcing society to confront them head-on. In her later years, she raised 2 daughters. One of them became an accomplished show jumper and indulged her love for philanthropic causes and purebred dog breeding. Those around her attest that she has a sharp sense of humor, a fierce intelligence, and a capacity for warmth. The distance from her youth, it seems, has allowed her to heal or at least place her experiences in a context that might make sense to her. Was she brainwashed, assaulted, and coerced into playing the role of a guerrilla soldier? Or was there a spark in her, fueled by the era's rebellious undertones, that found a twisted outlet in the SLA's mission? In 2009, when she spoke on NBC, Patricia Hearst was clear about how she felt toward those who doubted her accounts of sexual assault, calling their viewpoint outrageous. Indeed, for many trauma survivors, having their experiences dismissed or undermined is a second violation. Hearst's indignation was not just about clearing her name, it was also about challenging a toxic narrative that suggests a captive must prove the sincerity of their terror. She confronted the rhetoric that had dogged her since the 1970s, refusing to let the story be reduced to an oversimplification of a rich girl playing revolutionary. Ultimately, Patricia Hearst's life is more than tabloid fodder or a sensational slice of pop history. It intersects with fundamental debates about power, identity, trauma, and redemption. She's not a simple case study in Stockholm Syndrome, nor is she a straightforward rebel icon. She's a human being whose story is rife with contradictions, some self-acknowledged, others projected onto her by a fascinated, sometimes unforgiving public. Even with the passing of time and the quieting of media frenzy, her name still conjures the image of a frightened figure standing in that San Francisco bank, machine gun in hand, flanked by radicals, The lines between captor and comrade hopelessly blurred. For an entire generation, that image asked America to confront its anxieties about class, revolution, and the possibility that even the wealthy could be violently dragged into the chaos of the 1970s. She was an heiress, a captive, a radical, a defendant, a convict, a mother, an actor, and a survivor. And that begs one final question, the same one that's lingered since 1974. Who was Patty Hearst, captive or radical? Maybe we'll never find a definitive answer,